Two pieces of parchment sat misfiled in an English library for the better part of a century, catalogued as nothing special, until a doctoral student named Alba Fideli looked closely at the handwriting and realized someone had gotten the date wrong by roughly 200 years. That manuscript is the Quran. Specifically, two leaves held today at the University of Birmingham, containing verses from 3 of its chapters, written in an early, slanted Arabic hand called Hijazi script. In 2015, when scientists finally tested the parchment itself, the results did something textbooks rarely allow. They overlapped with the lifetime of the man the text describes. The testing happened at the University of Oxford's radiocarbon accelerator unit. The verdict? The animal skin those leaves were cut from was almost certainly alive somewhere between the years 568 and 645, with better than 95% confidence. Muhammad is traditionally dated 570 to 632. For a moment, in a research library in the middle of England, the physical evidence and the tradition were standing close enough to touch. Tonight, we're not just looking at Birmingham. We're looking at a palimpsest pulled from the ceiling of a mosque in Yemen, a rock inscription cut into a cliff in the Arabian desert with an exact date scratched into it, and the single rule historians use to decide what any of this evidence actually proves. To feel how old 568 really is, measure it against something more familiar. When that goatskin was still walking around on 4 legs, the Western Roman Empire had only been gone for about a century. Rome's fall wasn't ancient history to whoever owned that animal. It was recent news. The parchment's real story starts not in the 7th century, but in the 1930s, in an industrial English city known more for chocolate than sacred texts. Edward Cadbury, heir to the chocolate manufacturing family and a devout Quaker, funded the collection of more than 3,000 Middle Eastern manuscripts, hoping to turn Birmingham into a serious center for religious study. The collection took its name from Alphonse Mingana, the priest and manuscript hunter who assembled it. For decades, 2 loose leaves inside that collection sat bound together with pages from a different, later Quran, filed as one object, unremarkable, unread. Then, in the 2010s, Alba Fideli began working through the Mingana collection for her doctoral thesis. She wasn't hunting for a discovery. She was doing the unglamorous work of comparing letter forms, page by page, the kind of labor that rarely makes headlines. But she noticed something the printed catalog had missed. The handwriting on those 2 loose leaves didn't match the manuscript they'd been bound to. It matched something centuries older. Notice what's missing from most versions of this story. Nobody planned this discovery. A young researcher's patience found it, decades after the manuscript first arrived in Birmingham. Here's the historian's rule, and it matters well beyond this one manuscript. Radiocarbon dating tells you when an animal died. It does not, by itself, tell you when someone wrote on its skin. Parchment could sit stored and traded for years before a scribe ever touched it with ink. The French manuscript specialist François Desroches has pointed out that radiocarbon results have occasionally mismatched manuscripts whose dates were already known by other means. So the Birmingham find doesn't prove, on its own, that Muhammad's own contemporaries wrote those specific words. The way I read this evidence, it doesn't need to prove that much. What it proves is narrower and still remarkable. Someone, working with parchment that old, was writing the Quran's text in a form already recognizable as the one read today, within a lifetime or two of the events the tradition describes. Professor David Thomas, who studies the history of Christianity and Islam at the University of Birmingham, has said the discovery placed the manuscript among the very earliest written copies of the Quran known to survive anywhere. That claim rests on 2 independent kinds of evidence agreeing with each other: the radiocarbon date and the paleography, the study of how handwriting styles shift over time. That's about as strong as this kind of argument gets. 1,000 miles to the south, in Yemen, a very different piece of evidence turned up by accident. This wasn't the first time an accident did more work than a plan. In 1972, restoration workers repairing the Great Mosque of Sana'a found a hidden space between the building's inner and outer roof, the kind of gap nobody checks until a wall gives way. Inside it were fragments of Quranic and non-Quranic writing, later estimated at pieces of nearly 1,000 separate manuscripts. A German scholar named Gerd Puin was sent to catalog the find in the early 1980s. Among the fragments, one turned out to be a palimpsest, a page scraped clean and written over, the way a whiteboard gets used twice. Under ultraviolet light, the erased layer became visible again, and the erased text didn't match the Quran as it's read today. The wording differed, the order of some material differed. Radiocarbon analysis by researchers Behnam Sadeghi and Uwe Bergman placed the parchment, with 68% probability, somewhere between 614 and 656, and with 95% probability before 669. Here's what I find striking about this particular page. Tradition holds that Caliph Uthman, once he'd standardized the Quran's wording, ordered earlier variant copies destroyed. If that's accurate, this page survived that order, whether by accident, neglect, or someone quietly declining to comply. Sadeghi and his co-author Mohsen Gudarzi called the erased text the single most important surviving witness to a version of the Quran outside the standard line, not because it contradicts the faith, but because it's the only page anyone has found that lets historians watch the standardization process happening. One more piece of physical evidence, and this one carries something the others don't: an exact date cut by a human hand. In the desert of what's now Saudi Arabia, along an old pilgrimage route once walked toward Syria, a rock face carries an inscription naming a man called Zuhair. It mentions the death of the second caliph, Umar. Historians date it to the year 24 after the Hijra, 644 to 645 in the common calendar, making it the earliest securely dated Arabic inscription known to survive. It already shows a working system of diacritical dots, the small marks distinguishing similar-looking Arabic letters. That detail matters because it undercuts a popular explanation for why later Quran copies show variant readings, the assumption that early Arabic script was too primitive to write anything down precisely. Zuhair's inscription suggests otherwise, at least by this date. Three things stand out to me when you put these three objects side by side. First, none of them individually proves very much. A radiocarbon range, a scraped-over page, a rock carving. Each is a fragment, literally and figuratively. It's only when independent kinds of evidence, found in different countries by different people, start pointing the same direction that historians grow confident. Second, the story of how each object was found matters almost as much as what it says. A misfiled leaf, a collapsed wall, a carving nobody had cataloged yet. None of this evidence was handed down by tradition. It survived by accident, and it was noticed because someone happened to be looking closely at something everyone else had walked past. Third, pull back far enough and you'll notice this isn't really a story about one religion at all. Every major sacred text scholars have studied this way, whether it's the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, or the Quran, turns out to have a more complicated physical history than the version taught in Sunday school or Friday sermon. That's not an attack on any of them. It's what happens to any text old enough, important enough, and copied by hand often enough to survive 14 centuries. The manuscripts don't argue with faith. They argue with the assumption that history and faith are answering the same question. They aren't. Faith asks what a text means. Historians, working with parchment and radiocarbon and ultraviolet light, are only ever answering a narrower question. What can actually be verified about how the physical object came to exist? Those are different projects, and a person can take both seriously at once. You might think this is ancient history, but the same argument over whether historical method threatens faith plays out today every time a documentary touches the Dead Sea Scrolls or the historical Jesus. different scripture, same nervousness, same answer. None of this, not Birmingham, not Sana'a, not the rock face in the desert, tells us how the book, now called the Quran, got assembled into the shape millions of people read today. History doesn't teach us who was right about that process. It teaches us how fragile the evidence for any grand claim about it usually turns out to be. That's a separate story, and it involves a battlefield, a grieving caliph, and a scribe who kept insisting he needed a second witness before he'd write down a single line. It starts with a simple human problem. Too many people who had memorized the text were suddenly dead, and somebody had to decide what to do about that. The battlefield at Yamama went quiet in a way that frightened the men who survived it. Not the ordinary quiet after a fight, a specific silence where a specific sound used to be. The sand there still carried the smell of blood and scorched leather long after the fighting stopped. For months, wherever Muslim soldiers gathered, someone had been reciting the Quran aloud, from memory, the way it had always been carried. At Yamama, in the year 632, hundreds of those reciters died fighting the armies of a rival prophet named Musaylima. The Quran itself did not go anywhere that day, but the number of men who carried the whole of it in living memory suddenly dropped, and everyone standing in that silence understood exactly what it meant. Umar ibn al-Khattab understood it fastest. He went straight to Caliph Abu Bakr with a fear that still sounds strikingly modern. If this kept happening, the sacred text itself could start disappearing, piece by piece, with every reciter who fell in battle. Abu Bakr's first response, according to the tradition, was resistance rather than agreement. How could he authorize something the Prophet himself had never ordered done? No one had compiled the Quran into a single bound book while Muhammad was alive. It had lived in memory, on palm leaf stalks, on flat stones, on scraps of leather, scattered across a young and still-forming community. But Umar kept pressing the case, and Abu Bakr reluctantly agreed. The job went to a young scribe named Zayd ibn Thabit, chosen for 4 specific reasons the sources are careful to spell out: his intelligence, his trustworthiness, his youth, and the fact that he had personally served as one of Muhammad's own scribes during the Prophet's lifetime. Zayd later described the weight of the assignment in blunt terms. He said that if they had asked him to move a mountain, it would have felt lighter than the task he'd been handed. He did not simply write down what he already had memorized. According to the account preserved in Sahih Bukhari, Zayd insisted on 2 independent witnesses for every single verse before he would commit it to the page, even material he already knew by heart. At one point in the process, he searched for a specific verse from the closing lines of Surah At-Tawbah and could not find a second source for it anywhere in the community, until he located it preserved with exactly one companion, a man named Huzaima al-Ansari. Nowhere else. The later commentator Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani pointed to that detail specifically, arguing it shows Zayd's own memory was never treated as sufficient on its own, no matter how trusted he was. Everything had to be checked against something outside his own head. The finished compilation passed from Abu Bakr to Umar, and after Umar's death, to his daughter Hafsa, one of Muhammad's widows and, by several accounts, one of the few people in the community who could read and write. For roughly a decade, that was the whole story. One guarded compilation, kept in one household, referenced when needed. 20 years later, a second and very different problem surfaced. As the Muslim community expanded into Syria, Iraq, and beyond, soldiers taught the Quran to new converts in their own regional accents, and small variations in pronunciation began hardening into real disagreements about whose version was correct. During a military campaign in Armenia and Azerbaijan, a commander named Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman watched troops from different provinces argue bitterly over their recitations, and it worried him enough that he traveled straight to Caliph Uthman. Read between the lines of his warning, as later sources recorded, and you can hear real fear. He invoked the Jews and the Christians directly, telling Uthman not to let this community fracture over its scripture the way those older communities reportedly had over theirs. We've seen this before in a sense, though rarely told this way. Christian bishops would gather at Nicaea within Islam's own lifetime, arguing over the wording of a creed. Jewish scholars across centuries would fix a Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible letter by letter. Standardizing a sacred text after it starts spreading across cultures and languages is not unique to any one faith. It's what happens whenever a young religious movement outgrows the room it was born in. Uthman requested Hafsa's guarded copy, assembled a small committee once again under Zayd, this time joined by Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, Sa'id ibn al-As, and Abd al-Rahman ibn al-Harith, and had it copied into a single standardized text based on the dialect of the Quraysh tribe. Copies went out to the major garrison cities, Kufa, Basra, Damascus, and Medina. Other variant copies were ordered destroyed. Tradition holds this went smoothly almost everywhere, with one notable exception. In Kufa, some sources say, followers of a companion named Ibn Mas'ud resisted handing over their own version, unwilling to see a text they'd learned directly from Muhammad's circle discarded for someone else's committee. Ibn Mas'ud himself had been among the earliest converts, a man who had personally served Muhammad and memorized the Quran in his presence, and his followers apparently felt his authority on the matter outranked a committee assembled decades after the fact. Not every detail of that resistance is agreed upon among later historians, but the disagreement itself is telling. This is the traditional account, and it's attested across multiple independent lines of hadith transmission, which is worth pausing on, because it connects to a much bigger question about how any of this history actually reaches us. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Everything in the last several paragraphs, Yamama, Zayd, Hudayfa, Uthman's committee, the holdouts in Kufa, comes from a body of material written down generations after it supposedly happened. The earliest surviving biography of Muhammad, compiled by a historian named Ibn Ishaq, wasn't assembled until around the year 767, something like 130 to 150 years after Muhammad's death. And Ibn Ishaq's own original text doesn't survive either. What historians actually read today is a later editor named Ibn Hisham's reworking of it, produced roughly 60 years after Ibn Ishaq died, meaning the version on the page sits about 2 centuries downstream of the events it describes. That is a real gap. If you ask me, it's the single most important thing to understand about this whole period, more important than any specific detail of the Yamama story. Notice what's missing compared to what we covered earlier. The physical Quran text itself has manuscript evidence dating within decades of the traditional timeline. The story of exactly how that text got assembled survives only as narrative, passed down for generations and finally written by people who were never there to see it. That doesn't automatically make the narrative false. Look at the pattern historians actually use to weigh it. The German scholar Harold Motzke developed a method called Isnad cum Matan analysis, cross-checking both the chain of people who passed a report along and the specific wording of the report itself. Applying that method to some of this material, Motzke argued certain reports can be reliably traced back to witnesses close to the original events, even though nobody wrote them down as one connected, bound narrative until generations later. An oral chain, checked carefully enough, isn't automatically worthless just because it's old. Sound familiar? We do something similar every time we trust a detailed oral history project or a court testimony reconstructed from memory decades after a crime, or a journalist's account built from sources who only agreed to talk years after the fact. We don't throw any of that out just because it arrived late. We check who's saying it, how many independent people say the same thing, and whether the small, awkward details hold up under pressure, rather than smoothing themselves into something too convenient. What strikes me most is how this splits one big question into 2 smaller, more honest ones. Is the finished Quran text old and physically stable? The manuscripts already answered that, and answered it well. Is the specific story about Zayd, Yamama, and Hudayfa accurate down to every detail? That's a separate, harder question, and careful historians hold it more loosely, precisely because of that 2-century gap sitting underneath it. There's a deeper truth at work in keeping those two questions apart, instead of quietly collapsing them into one. None of this settles what actually happened centuries earlier, at a shrine some early Muslims were praying toward, and which later evidence suggests might not have been where the tradition says it was. How do you know which way to face when you have no compass, no satellite, and the nearest expert is 1,000 miles and several years away? That was the practical problem sitting underneath one of Islam's daily prayers from its very first years. Face the qibla, the sacred direction, toward the Kaaba in Mecca. Simple to say, much harder to solve if you were the person laying out a new mosque in Damascus or Fustat, or a garrison town on the edge of the known world, with nothing but the sun, the stars, and second-hand directions to work from. And when modern researchers went back and actually measured the orientation of the earliest surviving mosques using compasses and satellite coordinates unavailable to anyone in the 7th century, they found something genuinely strange. Many of these buildings do not point precisely at Mecca, not by a small margin either. Some sit dozens of degrees off, in directions that seem at first glance almost random, scattered across North Africa, the Levant, and Iraq like a puzzle nobody had bothered to solve for 13 centuries. Walk the floor plan of enough of these buildings, ruler and compass in hand, and the mismatch is not subtle. It's the kind of discrepancy that invites a story. That real, documented puzzle is where an independent researcher named Dan Gibson built a very different explanation, one detailed enough to fill a book called Early Islamic Qiblas, and later a documentary film. Gibson isn't trained as a historian of Islamic astronomy or Nabatean archaeology. He came to the subject from outside those specialist fields, which doesn't automatically make him wrong, but it does mean his methodology never passed through the kind of peer review that catches errors before they reach an audience. He argued that if you plot enough of these early mosque orientations on a map, the lines converge less on Mecca and more on Petra, the famous rock-cut city in what's now Jordan. His conclusion? Petra, not Mecca, functioned as Islam's first holy city for decades, maybe longer, before the Qibla was quietly redirected south, sometime around the reign of the Caliph Abd al-Malik. It's a dramatic claim, and it spread widely, picked up in online debates and documentary specials, precisely because the underlying puzzle it's trying to solve is completely real. Here's the version they don't tell you in most retellings of Gibson's theory. The specialists who actually study historical Islamic astronomy have taken his numbers apart, mosque by mosque, and the results are not close. David King, a historian who has spent much of his career reconstructing exactly how early Muslims calculated sacred direction, published a detailed rebuttal, walking through building after building in Gibson's own dataset, checking each claim against the historical record rather than against a modern atlas. Take the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, built in the year 709. Its orientation sits at roughly 177 degrees. Petra bears about 193 degrees from that spot. Mecca bears about 165. The mosque doesn't point cleanly at either. It sits between them, which tells you almost nothing on its own, and tells you even less once you learn the building was constructed on the site of an older Byzantine cathedral, itself built over a Roman temple, both already fixed on that patch of ground for reasons that had nothing to do with Islam. Take another example. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, dated by Gibson to around 709, sits at roughly 183 degrees. Petra bears close to 194 degrees from Jerusalem. Mecca bears about 161. Once again, the real number falls between the two competing answers, favoring neither cleanly. King's explanation is straightforward. Builders across this period were working with a rough convention, essentially pointing south, not calculating an exact bearing toward any single city, Petra included. The question nobody asks when this theory gets repeated online is a simple one. What method were 7th century builders actually using? Gibson's numbers compare historic mosque orientations against modern geographic coordinates for Petra and Mecca, calculated with tools no one in the year 700 had access to. King's argument, developed across decades of research into medieval Islamic sources, is that early builders weren't doing precise geographic math at all. Medieval geographic texts describe something called qiblat al-sahaba, the customary direction favored by the first generation of Muslims in a given region, typically set by watching where the sun rose or set at the solstices, not by calculating a bearing toward a specific city. King has noted, pointedly, that no scholar of Nabatean history, the specialists who actually study Petra itself, has ever independently arrived at Gibson's conclusion. Not one. In my view, that last detail matters more than any single mosque's orientation. A genuinely new historical claim about where Islam's holiest site sat for decades should show up somewhere in the specialist literature on Petra, written by people with no stake in Islamic origins debates one way or the other. It hasn't. Which brings us to the actual mystery, the one King's research uncovers instead. And it's better than the one Gibson proposed. Early Muslim builders, working without precise instruments, oriented mosques using astronomical horizon phenomena, the exact points on the horizon where the sun rises or sets on the summer and winter solstices, angles that are fixed, visible, and repeatable anywhere on Earth without a single calculation. A builder in Fustat, in Egypt, oriented his mosque toward the point of winter sunrise on the horizon. A builder working in Iraq used winter sunset instead, a mirror image method suited to his own location. Neither man needed maps, instruments, or knowledge of exact latitude and longitude. They needed only a clear morning or evening sky and a tradition telling them which horizon event to watch for. Different cities ended up with different customary qiblas, not because anyone was confused about where Mecca was, but because everyone was using a consistent, logical method that was never built for pinpoint geographic accuracy in the first place. The Kaaba itself, some researchers have noted, appears to carry its own astronomical alignment, which may be exactly why this method felt so natural to builders working centuries later and hundreds of miles away. Same playbook, different mystery. What this tells us, I think, is something bigger than mosque angles. A real anomaly, a genuine gap between expectation and evidence, is fertile ground. Something will always grow there. The question is only whether what grows is careful reconstruction, the kind David King spent decades doing, or a tidier, more dramatic story that resolves the anomaly with a single dramatic twist. The second kind travels faster online. It always has, long before the internet existed to speed it along. History rhymes here with plenty of other fields. A real unexplained pattern in the data, followed by a theory that explains it too perfectly, followed by specialists quietly doing the unglamorous work of showing why the neat answer doesn't hold up. What strikes me most, watching this particular argument play out over the years, is how little the rebuttal actually travels compared to the original claim. King's detailed papers, published across more than a decade, rarely reach the same audience as a single, striking documentary clip. That isn't a problem unique to Islamic history. Look at the pattern in almost any field with a passionate popular following and a small community of specialists. Flat Earth claims outrun basic geometry, ancient astronaut theories outrun basic archaeology, and a compelling qibla map outruns a footnote about solstice sunrises. The correction is almost always more accurate and almost always less shareable. None of this resolves how the qibla, or anything else about the new religion taking shape in Arabia, related to the older monotheisms already surrounding it on every side. Byzantine Christians to the north and west, Sasanian Zoroastrians to the east, Jewish communities scattered through the peninsula itself, each with their own scriptures, their own prayer directions, their own centuries of practice already in place before Muhammad's first followers ever needed to decide which way to kneel. That question of who these early believers actually understood themselves to be and who they were willing to pray alongside turns out to be one of the most contested in the entire field. And it starts with a word that shows up in the earliest sources far more often than the word most people would expect. Ask most people when Islam became its own separate religion, distinct from Judaism and Christianity, and they'll assume the answer is obvious. From the very first revelation, sometime after the year 610, fully formed from day one. One of the most respected historians of early Islam disagrees, and his argument starts with something almost embarrassingly simple. He went back to the earliest surviving documents from the movement Muhammad led and counted which word the community actually used to describe itself. Fred Donner, who has spent his career at the University of Chicago studying this period, found that the earliest sources overwhelmingly call the community al-Mu'minun, the believers, rather than reaching for a separate, exclusive word for a brand new religion competing against its neighbors. His argument, laid out at length in a book called Muhammad and the Believers, is that the movement Muhammad led started as something broader than a new confession set against Judaism and Christianity. It was, in his reading, a strict monotheist reform movement, urgent and demanding, open to righteous Jews and Christians who accepted its core requirements, provided they lived according to their own revealed law and behaved righteously by its standards, rather than converting to a wholly separate creed. A fully separate, exclusive Muslim identity, distinct from the older monotheism surrounding it, only crystallized, on this account, roughly a century later, once the movement's leaders needed to draw sharper lines around who counted as a member of the community and who didn't. Donner points to a real document to support this, not just Quranic verses read a particular way. The Constitution of Medina, generally regarded, even by skeptical historians, as the earliest surviving Islamic political document, dates to the first year after Muhammad's move to Medina in the year 622. It describes a single community, an ummah, that includes named Jewish tribes alongside Muhammad's own followers, bound together by shared political obligations and mutual defense, rather than shared creed alone. If you ask me, that detail is worth sitting with for a moment. A founding political document that names Jewish tribes as full members of the community, with real obligations and real protections, is not what most people expect from the origin story of a religion often assumed to have been exclusive from its very first day. And like every other narrative detail about this period, the document itself reaches modern readers only through Ibn Ishaq's telling, written more than a century after the fact. Even the evidence for inclusion arrives by the same long, indirect route as everything else. Not every serious historian buys the argument, and this is where the field gets genuinely interesting rather than settled. Patricia Crone, reviewing Donner's book directly, argued that the actual textual evidence for an ecumenical early Islam comes down to a small handful of Quranic verses, with the rest of the reconstruction built on inference rather than direct proof. She pointed out that a glowing review in a major newspaper had praised Donner's picture of a nice, tolerant, and open early Islam, precisely the kind of account that appeals to modern liberal sensibilities, and suggested that appeal itself should make historians more suspicious, not less, of how easily a comforting story can pass for a well-evidenced one. Crone's own instincts run skeptical by nature. She's the same historian who, decades earlier, helped popularize one of the field's most radical revisionist theories about Islamic origins, and later walked much of it back herself, calling it, in her own words, an immature hypothesis rather than a settled finding. Even a historian that willing to challenge tradition, that comfortable overturning her own earlier work in public, found Donner's picture too tidy to fully trust. The German historian Tilman Nagel goes further still, arguing the Believers' movement had a distinctly separate identity from its very first years, one willing to wage religious conflict against polytheists, Jews, and Christians alike whenever they refused its terms. On Nagel's reading, the word believers was never quite as inclusive as Donner suggests it to have been. It described a specific subset within a movement that saw itself as distinct from the outset, not a big ecumenical tent that only narrowed later. Nagel argues his version fits the earliest biographical material better than Donner's does, particularly the accounts of military campaigns waged specifically because a group refused to accept the new movement's terms. Two respected historians, working from largely the same limited pool of surviving sources, reach opposite conclusions about how open the door actually was at the very beginning of the movement. That alone should tell you something about how thin the sourcing really is at this exact point in the story. We've seen this before in other new religious movements. A broad, urgent call in the earliest years, welcoming everyone willing to answer it, followed by boundaries hardening as the movement survives long enough to need clearer rules about who belongs and who doesn't. Early Christianity went through something similar, arguing for generations over whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law at all before the boundary finally settled. Different costumes, same underlying pressure. Movements that start as open calls to conscience tend to become institutions with membership rules, and the transition rarely happens on a single clean date any historian can point to with confidence. It happens in committee rooms, in arguments nobody wrote down carefully enough, over years that blur together by the time anyone gets around to telling the story afterward. None of this argument happens in a vacuum, and here's where the wider world matters as much as any single document. In the decades right before Muhammad's first followers gathered, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had just finished fighting each other into exhaustion, a war stretching from the year 602 to 628 that drained both sides of money, soldiers, and political stability almost simultaneously. Two empires that had dominated the region for centuries came out of that war weaker than they had been in generations, right at the moment a new movement was gathering strength on their shared frontier. Cities changed hands more than once, tax bases collapsed, populations across the region, many of them already religiously mixed, some resentful of whichever empire currently controlled their taxes and their churches, watched two exhausted superpowers stagger out of decades of war within a single generation of the Arab conquests that followed almost immediately after. Look at who benefited from that exhaustion. Not Byzantium, not Persia, weakened on the opposite frontier. A new monotheist movement, arriving with a message that could plausibly appeal across sectarian lines exactly when those lines had already been worn thin by decades of imperial war and religious persecution on both sides of the border. What I think actually happened is something historians are still working out in real time, and Donner, Crone, and Nagel are not describing three completely separate realities, three different Muhammads, three different movements. They're arguing about emphasis and timeline within evidence all three of them have read closely and cited carefully. Donner sees inclusion at the founding moment. Crone sees a reconstruction resting on too little direct proof, however appealing it sounds to modern ears. Nagel sees exclusivity that was there from the start, just described in language that sounds, at a distance of 14 centuries, more generous than it actually was in practice. None of the three is accusing the others of bad faith or sloppy scholarship. They're reading the same handful of documents and weighing the same silences differently, which is a very different thing from one of them simply being wrong. In my view, that disagreement isn't a failure of the field. It's what honest historical work on a thinly documented founding period actually looks like. Serious people, reading the same handful of documents, reaching different conclusions, and none of them pretending the question is closed. Notice what's missing from most popular retellings of this period: the confidence. Most versions you'll encounter online pick one of these three positions and present it as settled, because a confidence story is easier to tell than an honest argument still in progress. The documents themselves are more ambiguous than any single version of the story lets on, and that ambiguity should keep you up at night less than it should keep you honest about what can and cannot actually be known from this distance. Underneath every argument this part has covered, Zayd's committee, the desert rock face, the mosque angles, the word count in the earliest texts, sits the same older, more human question. What do you actually owe the truth when the people who lived it are already gone and only their fragments remain? What if none of it had survived? No Birmingham leaves, still miscatalogued, still bound to the wrong manuscript, gathering dust in a drawer for another 100 years before anyone noticed the handwriting was wrong. No collapsed wall in Sana'a, and so no ceiling full of forgotten fragments ever seeing daylight again, still sealed above a mosque nobody thought to look inside. No rock face in the desert, worn smooth by another 13 centuries of wind before a single person thought to look closely at what was carved there. The name Zuhair eroding back into blank stone along with everyone's memory of him. It very nearly went that way. Most of history does. What we've spent this whole story examining is not the ordinary case. It's the exception. The fragments that happen to survive fire, damp, war, and simple human indifference long enough to be found by someone paying attention on an ordinary working day, doing a job that rarely makes anyone famous. That's worth sitting with, because it changes what kind of question we've actually been answering across 4 parts. We were never asking whether the Quran is true or whether the faith built around it is correct. That's not a question parchment and radiocarbon labs can answer, and it never was, no matter how the hook of a video like this one gets phrased to earn a click. We were asking something narrower and, in its own way, more answerable. What can be verified about how a specific set of physical objects came to exist, and what those objects can and cannot tell us about the centuries immediately after they were made? None of this is an argument against belief, and it's worth saying that plainly and clearly, because it's easy to hear 4 parts of manuscripts, disputed qiblas, and academic feuds, and assume the point was to chip away at something sacred. It wasn't. Scholars who have spent entire careers on the Sana'a Palimpsest, on Hijazi script, on Isnad chains stretching back 1,000 years, include people who hold the faith themselves alongside people who don't, working from within the same footnotes, citing the same manuscripts, disagreeing about the same details rather than about whether the details are worth examining at all. Historical inquiry into a sacred text isn't a project imposed from outside by people hostile to it. It's carried out in large part by people who live inside the tradition and want to understand its origins more precisely, standing alongside people who approach it from entirely outside and want much the same thing for different reasons. Faith asks what a text means and what a life should look like lived in response to it. History asks a smaller, more mechanical question: what happened, and what evidence survives to show it? Those aren't competing answers to the same question. They're different questions entirely, asked with different tools, aimed at different kinds of certainty, and a person can sit with both at once, on the same evening, without any contradiction at all. In my view, that's the real thread connecting every single part of this story, more than any one manuscript or mosque or academic feud. Notice what's missing from most retellings of contested religious history: the version built for outrage rather than understanding. The possibility that rigorous and reverent aren't opposites. The Birmingham leaves didn't need to prove more than they could actually support to be worth caring about deeply. The disputed qibla direction didn't need Petra to be interesting. The real explanation, involving solstice horizons and centuries of careful, unglamorous convention, turned out to be better than the invented one, once somebody bothered to check. The argument between Donner, Crone, and Nagel didn't need a declared winner to be worth having in the first place. Every time this story reached for the dramatic, tidy resolution, the evidence quietly declined to provide one. And what was left instead was something slower and, if you ask me, considerably more honest. Real people, working with real fragments, doing careful work that mostly doesn't make headlines and rarely trends online. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same shape as good journalism, good courtroom testimony, good science. Not a single dramatic reveal, but a slow accumulation of independent, imperfect evidence that only becomes trustworthy once enough of it, found by different people for different reasons, starts pointing the same rough direction. The official record, in any field worth trusting, is rarely a single document handed down intact. It's a pile of fragments that specialists have learned, through decades of trial and correction, how to weigh carefully against each other. You've likely watched this exact pattern play out somewhere else without naming it. Look at the pattern in your own life for a moment. A home DNA test turns up a grandparent nobody had mentioned, and a family story gets quietly rewritten around a fact nobody was hiding, just nobody had bothered to check. A newly declassified file confirms most of what a memoir already claimed and revises one detail nobody expected, without discrediting the memoir as a whole. An old photograph gets colorized, and suddenly a distant war looks less like a black and white abstraction and more like something that happened to people with actual faces, actual coats, actual mud on their boots. None of these moments overturn the larger story. They sharpen it. That's what manuscripts like Birmingham and Sana'a are doing to 14 centuries of Quranic history. Not rewriting the story from scratch, and not confirming every detail of it either, but sharpening a picture that was already, in its broad outlines, roughly correct. Three things stand out to me now, looking back across everything this story has covered. First, the physical text of the Quran has stronger, earlier manuscript support than most people, on either side of any given debate, actually realize. Support that rivals or exceeds what survives for most other ancient sacred texts of comparable age. Second, the narrative surrounding that text, how it was compiled, where its earliest community prayed, who exactly belonged to it in those first uncertain years, survives through a much longer and more human chain of transmission. One that deserves genuine scrutiny rather than either blind trust or blanket dismissal in either direction. Third, and this is the one that lingers longest for me, the gap between those two facts isn't a scandal waiting to be uncovered by the next dramatic documentary. It's simply what survives, after 14 centuries, of any sufficiently old and important human thing, whether the thing in question is a scripture, a founding political charter, or a courtroom transcript nobody thought to preserve properly at the time. Every old institution carries a version of this same gap somewhere inside it, whether anyone has bothered to go looking yet or not. Pull back far enough and this stops being a story about one manuscript, one mosque, or one scholarly feud, and becomes a story about how fragile the record of any distant certainty actually is, once you go looking at it directly instead of accepting whatever version arrived secondhand and already smoothed into something tidier than the truth. History doesn't hand us a verdict about who was right. It hands us goatskin, ink, and the occasional collapsed wall, and asks patient people to spend entire careers figuring out exactly what those fragments can honestly bear, and where they finally run out into simple, unresolved silence. Somewhere in an English research library tonight, 2 leaves of parchment still sit inside a climate-controlled case, cut from an animal that had been alive and breathing when Rome's fall was still recent news rather than ancient history in anyone's mind. The ink on those pages has survived the reign of every caliph, every empire that has risen and fallen across the region since, 2 world wars, and a century of being quietly, almost comically, misfiled in the wrong folder. It has outlasted the Mingana collection's original cataloger, outlasted Alba Fideli's supervisors, and it will very likely outlast everyone currently reading a headline about it. They don't resolve anything about what the words written on them ultimately mean. They were never going to, and no manuscript ever could. What they do is smaller, and this story would argue, better. They hold the line between what can be known and what can only be believed, and they let us watch, fragment by fragment, patiently and honestly, exactly where that line actually falls. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.